Alfred Thayer Mahan's fellow U.S. naval officers knew him as a thinker and writer than a ship handler. He ended his last command as captain of the cruiser Chicago to a less than stellar report from his superior. Captain Mahan's interests lie wholly in the direction of literary work and in no other way connected with the service. Mahan is remembered not for his career at sea, but for publishing The Influence of Sea Power upon History in May 1890 while teaching at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, becoming the foremost thinker on sea power. Mahan argued, specifically to the US, that a nation becomes a great power through sea power. In his analysis of the empire clashes between the Netherlands, Spain, France, and Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries, Mahan asserted that great commercial seafaring states had played a leading role in world politics because of the wealth they generated from international trade and access to resources from around the globe. Controlling major trade routes across the seas was the mission of navies in war. Mahan's work not only validated Great Britain's Royal Navy and the British Empire it helped create, protect and sustain itself, but it also influenced Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II to build up the Kaiserliche Marine to challenge the British. This naval arms race between Britain and Germany became a significant factor in the great power rivalry that led to World War I. Imperial Japan, seeking to create its empire to counter Europe's expansion into Asia, would model their navy and its doctrines after the British and Mahan. Mahan's naval principles centered around gaining and maintaining command of the seas, while denying one's opponents the same. Victory would go to the seagoing nation with the greater naval force with an offensive maritime strategy, in concentrated action to seek and destroy the enemy naval force. Overbearing power on the sea, which drives the enemy's flag from it, or allows it to appear only as a fugitive, and which, by controlling the great common, closes the highways by which commerce moves to and from the enemy's shores. The Mahanian dogmas were the cult of the big gun battleship, the iron rule of concentration, and the annihilation of the enemy fleet in a single decisive battle. Japan encountered Mahan's maritime theories when its leaders debated whether to follow a continental or maritime strategy to create its empire. After the Meiji regime wrestled power in 1868 from the declining Tokugawa shogunate and feudal domains, the Meiji government sent observers to Europe and the US to learn the West's military, political, economic, legal, social, and educational institutions. Known by historians as the Meiji Restoration, Japan began to westernize domestically and modeled its army after Prussia and its navy after Britain. Naval officer Ogasawara Naganari introduced Mahan's doctrine to Japan in 1898. He used Mahan to argue that, from olden times, the rise and fall of a sea power has gone hand in hand with the ebb and flow of national power and prestige. As Mahan's keystroke to take command of the seas rested on the decisive battle between navies, battleships were the sine qua non of Mahanian thought. All the great powers and pretenders followed Mahan's proclamations. Japan's victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War for the domination of Manchuria and Korea firmly established Japan as the great power in the region. During the Battle of Tsushima, Mahanian disciple Admiral Togo Heichachiro led the combined Japanese fleet to a crushing victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet, ending the war. Russia lost all 12 battleships, with over 12,000 officers and seamen killed or captured. Japan lost only 3 torpedo boats, 117 dead, and 583 wounded. The Imperial Japanese Navy saw Tsushima as proof that Mahan's decisive naval battle through the concentration of battleships was how to eradicate the opposing navy and win a war. Japan first perceived the US as a hypothetical enemy in 1907 regarding control over the Western Pacific. The US added the Philippines and Guam to its territories in the Pacific after its victory in the Spanish-American War, which Japan saw as an impediment to its growing empire. The IJN understood in 1908 that it lacked the strength to carry the war into US waters, so it planned to fight a defensive war near Japan. During the interwar period, the IJN developed its attrition annihilation strategy to defeat the US Navy's War Plan Orange. Japan planned to attrit the US Navy with submarines, destroyers, and air power as the US sailed toward Japan. Then, once the US entered Japanese waters, according to Mahanian principles, the IJN would concentrate its capital ships for a decisive victory. War Plan Orange anticipated a quick Japanese victory in the Western Pacific. The US Navy planned to sail across the Pacific, taking Japanese island strong points, and once it arrived in the Western Pacific, hunt down and annihilate the main battle fleet of the Japanese Navy. Both the US Navy and the IJN thought in Mahanian terms. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the most prominent Japanese naval officer who challenged the prevailing focus on large battleships with heavy guns. He believed that naval air power and carriers had become more critical than battleships. Additionally, he argued that Japan's war against the US would be prolonged and not determined by a single engagement. The admiral had no confidence in the traditional Japanese war plan of interceptive operations to reduce the strength of the American fleet, and correctly predicted the US Navy would not send its fleet into the Western Pacific to save the Philippines in the first phase of the war. Yamamoto understood his future opponent enough to know the US would husband its forces, build up to overwhelming strength, and return by way of a methodical island-hopping campaign. If Yamamoto couldn't dissuade his comrades from pursuing war, and if the US refused to fall into the IJN's trap of attrition and annihilation, how could he strike the US Navy and give Japan a glimmer of success? The answer: Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto wished to avoid war with the US because he knew it would be a war of attrition that Japan had so little a chance of success. He famously said, "If we are ordered to do it, then I can raise havoc with the Americans for the first 6 months or a year, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. His fellow naval leadership also understood that Japan had little prospects against the US. However, they felt compelled to attack by the fanatical middle ranks and Japan's political right, who were determined to fulfill Japan's imperial destiny. His attack on Pearl Harbor was an 11th-hour revolt against more than 30 years of war planning, which had envisioned a decisive fleet battle in the Western Pacific. Although the surprise attack devastated the battleships of the US Pacific Fleet, the IJN's Kido Butai missed Yamamoto's primary targets, the US carriers, which were out at sea. As a result, the attack was only a tactical success at best. Operationally, it failed, as Pearl Harbor's fuel depots and repair stations remained intact. When Admiral Chester Nimitz reviewed the damage over Christmas and saw the untouched fuel and repair stations, he stated, "That was a most serious error. Had our oil supply been destroyed, and considering the tremendous shortage of fuel and petroleum production generally in Europe, it would have taken years to re-establish that supply and would have delayed our Pacific War accordingly." Imperial Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor was a strategic failure, comparable to Germany's Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. The Imperial Japanese Navy's surprise attack provoked the United States to seek vengeance against Japan, mobilize its industrial might, and strive for absolute victory. During the Pacific Theater, the IJN sought but failed to deliver a devastating blow to the US Navy. This failure led to a prolonged war of attrition, a common outcome in modern warfare after a failed battle of annihilation. The war ultimately consumed Japan, leading to its utter defeat. Ironically, the IJN became a victim of its early successes. The US Navy had to reorganize its fleet around aircraft carriers because its battleships were heavily damaged or sunk. Similarly, the Royal Navy suffered a devastating loss when Japanese air power sank the battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse in the South China Sea 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Japan's successes against both the Royal Navy and the US Navy compelled these forces to abandon the Mahanian principle of the Big Gun Club. Consequently, battleships were relegated to a supporting role, with carriers becoming the primary capital ships. In contrast, the IJN, with few exceptions like Yamamoto, continued to prioritize battleships for a climactic Mahanian clash as late as 1944. They believed the Yamato spirit could secure victory against overwhelming odds. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed in Mahanian principles but misused and misapplied them, as Japan lacked the means and geopolitical conditions to fulfill a uniquely American doctrine of overseas expansion and a universally applicable strategic theory. After the war, Admiral Inoue Shigeyoshi wrote that Japan lacked most of the elements of a great sea power required to wage war with the United States, namely 1. A secure territorial position, 2. Human resources, and 3. Material resources. On the 14th of October 1940, Yamamoto wrote to the secretary of Prince Saionji, "To fight the United States is like fighting the whole world, but it has been decided, so I will fight the best I can. Doubtless I shall die on board Nagato. Meanwhile, Tokyo will be burnt to the ground 3 times." Yamamoto would not survive the war to see how prophetic he was.